I'm kind of loosely affiliated with Thomas International, who sells assessments, but I'm a test developer, one of the test developers of the HPTI. So we work together on a lot of stuff, but I'm a full-time employee at most other stuff. I've written a few books in the last few years, all on this topic of high potential, success. Can you see those? Yeah. Myths of work. So a lot of these books have stuff related to what I'm going to talk about today. When we talk about motivation and performance, a big part of that is employee engagement, success, and high potential, personality traits, and some of the personality traits we're going to talk to today have a really strong relationship with employee well-being, with organizational commitment, with different metrics of success, potential, and health is really tied into that. So a lot of other stuff I've done related to consulting. I've been in a lot of different industries, different companies. I've done stuff like labor market forecasting. I've done a lot of strategic planning. I've done a lot of consulting looking at succession planning, retention for different countries, or companies in different countries. And one of the really consistent things I find is there's two issues that almost all companies have, irrespective of what industry they're in, or what country they're in, what their focus is, and employee engagement and well-being is a really, really common issue. I'm going to give you some case studies about that when we go back later on. And it manifests differently in different companies, but really consistently, a lot of companies, no matter what they do, are focused on this. Because people who are healthy, people who are psychologically healthy, perform better, are more effective, they have lower turnover, higher engagement rates, and it's a huge, huge business imperative to have healthy, kind of psychologically well people. So there's a lot of consistencies in these, even though they're doing different stuff. I won't go into specific examples. But the four main things I'm going to go over today are healthy organizations. So what does that mean? What does engagement look like? What is mental health at work? That one can be very clear. I'm going to talk about the role of leadership because it's so important if you're doing an intervention or you're having a culture of company change. The leadership needs to be on board. They need to be bought in and they need to be modeling the behavior. So it's absolutely useless to say we're going to do a company engagement policy if the leadership isn't going to practice that themselves. If they're going to be burnt out working long hours and setting that example for everyone else in the company, that stuff isn't going to filter down. People aren't going to buy into it if the top people in the company are not doing it themselves. So that is really important. And we'll talk a bit about what types of leaders will do that and what to look for in leadership for that. And then I'm going to talk about the traits of high potential leaders. So this is the HPTI, which I developed with Adrian Burnham. It's a personality test specifically designed to measure potential in leadership. So I'll talk a bit more about that too, what we did, what the traits are, and how that relates to engagement and mental health. Because personality has a really strong connection to how engaged people are at work, but also different personality traits. People on different ends of personality spectrums need different types of supports, need different sorts of resources, need different sorts of programs. So understanding those individual differences can really help you understand employee engagement and well-being in the workplace a bit more. And then I'm going to talk about individual well-being and kind of the relationship between individual well-being, team health, organizational health. Because really you can look at people's individual health as metrics of the overall culture. And so healthy organizations, the World Health Organization says it's physical, mental, and social well-being. So we're talking about psychological health, we're talking about effective, successful support systems, social networks, the people around you, and beyond just health and safety. So it's not just reducing physical harm anymore, it's looking at psychological well-being, psychological engagement, and we have really effective ways of measuring that, and we know people who are healthy are more productive, they're more effective. People who have higher levels of mental health, who have fewer mental health problems, are more productive and effective. So we're not just reducing the harm, we're improving well-being as well as improving productivity, and looking at optimal levels of it. So one of the comparisons I want to make is looking in kind of the longer term perspective. If you look at the 20th century, about 90% of workplace injuries, deaths, physical problems have been prevented. So there's 90% less at the end of the 20th century than the first half. So between 1900 and 2000, 90% reduction in physical harm at work. That is a massive change. And I know we talk about stress at work and burnout at work and difficulties at work, but if you look at it in a long-term perspective, work is a lot better, a lot healthier, and a lot safer than it was 100 years ago. So now there's more focus on that kind of physical, physiological, 10 years, having a 90% reduction in kind of mental health problems would be a massive change. So I think it's good to look at it in that long-term perspective, is because we still got a long way to go, but there's huge opportunities to improve productivity, to have savings, and to make workplaces a better place to work. So again, there's some estimates that workplace illness and injury costs up to 2% of GDP. I've seen estimates up to about 5%, but it's a huge cost. And I'm going to talk a bit more about why. But can we reduce psychological health problems in the workplace by 90% in the next 100 years? It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen immediately over the next week. But if it's a strategic priority, if it's something people are working on, continuing to do the research, developing, it's a huge opportunity for business. There's some evidence stress-related health problems are up since the 1970s, increasing. I think there's a few things going on in there, partly because it's very different to talk about stress and mental health that worked in the 70s. There's a lot of different stuff going on, cultural change in companies and flexible work, and job security. So this is something, we know it's an issue now, and I think people are starting to address it, and there are some companies who are doing very good things to address stress and mental health at work. But this is a big area for development, which is a great opportunity to focus on. The other thing I want to stress is the kind of range from burnout to engagement. So it's not necessarily an either-or thing, right? It's a continuum. There's different levels. You can be a little bit burnt out, you can be a little bit engaged, you can be very burnt out, you can be very engaged. And some of this work is from Chuck Kelly. There's some work he did in Utrecht. I think he's one of the best engagement researchers in this area. Thomas International also has an engagement survey that they use for looking at measuring all these different levels of kind of work and well-being. But when you look at the different ends of it, burnout is exhaustion, cynicism, inefficiency. Okay, stuff, basically. At the other end, it's engagement. So vigor, dedication, absorption. That's getting kind of energy, excitement, enjoyment in your work, and feeling very fulfilled by it. But it's not an either-or necessarily, it's a continuum. So stuff can happen day to day, week to week, month to month, that impacts this, that brings it up, that brings it down. Increasing levels of stress, increasing job demands, unreasonable job demands can kind of bring down the engagement. Things like job resources, social support, good management, all improves it. And it's really good to look at these as on individual levels. If your company does an engagement survey or looks at these things, if they do exit interviews, it's really good to look at the levels of different things coming out. So you might see one person leaving because they're burnt out or grumpy, but if you see a pattern of many, many people are having those issues, those are probably symptomatic of something that's going on in the company. Right? So if you have a really consistent pattern of complaints, exit interviews are a good way to find this out. Why are people leaving? If people are leaving for the same reason over and over and over again regularly, then that's something you want to look at, and is it something you can change? I mean, retention is hugely expensive. The estimates are it takes 1.5 years of someone's salary to replace them. That's in training costs, and development costs, and manager's time, and headhunting costs, all of that stuff. So if people are leaving because they're burnt out, it's a huge expense that is going to create more problems in the company. The other thing I've seen some companies doing recently is doing stay interviews. So, exit interviews are when someone's leaving, you ask them why they left, what might have kept them on. But these are interviews after, every 1 or 2 years for employees who have stayed to say, why are you still here? In a good way, in a positive way. Like, what do you like about it? What's keeping you here? We know you're still here, but what would tempt you to leave? And what can we do to make sure you stay? And that's a really good idea, especially if you're trying to keep those high potential people, those successful people, those engaged people that you put a lot of money and time into training, into development, into getting them part of the company. It's great to see that. And sometimes people will go into those if they know that they'll be listened to and say, it's really good, I'm staying at this company, but here's the reasons that might make you leave, or here's the stuff I don't like about it, or here's the stuff I think you could fix. So again, if you can identify those patterns and look at the data that you're getting from people, from asking people, sometimes it can give you a lot of information to see if there's potential problems in the culture or stuff that could change. So look at those kind of individual well-being aspects for looking at overall kind of workplace health. I brought an example here, which is a really good one. I've chosen it from the financial industry, partly because they get a lot of flack, so I wanted to give you an example of a bank doing very good things. So this is a credit union based in Canada, second largest credit union in Canada. I interviewed the CEO a couple times for the High Potential book, so I've got some good information about that. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is because even about 10, 15 years ago, they started doing amazing stuff for mental health. So the CEO was a very conscientious guy and wanted to looked at everything to do with the books. I'll talk a bit about that later too, but looked at his health insurance costs. So looked at the different costs that employees were making for their health insurance claims. And the number one claim people were making for, the number one expense, was antidepressants. So he looked at that and said, our biggest health cost for this company is antidepressants. There's something going wrong. So he did a lot of stuff to try and help out with that. He had mental health training, the Mental Health Association came in to get training for management, and looking at kind of having mental health first aid people on staff. The other thing he did is because his attitude again was this culture needs to come from the top. So he had kind of changed some of the policies related to his senior executives. So one of the things was that he was trying to reduce the culture of presenteeism. So when the office closed, the office closed. So you can get your work done, you have a reasonable amount of time to do it, but none of this, staying for 4 or 5 hours after work. I mean, getting rid of some of the stuff like some of the competitors. I've heard of financial associations, institutions having things like if you stay till 6, you have pizza, if you stay till 8, we'll give you beer, stay till 10 o'clock, we'll pay for the taxi home. I mean, if people have got pizza and beer and free booze and taxis, they're not going to be working, so why are you doing that? You're just keeping them there. So he did that. For a senior leadership team, he also said when you're on vacation, you can't call into the office. If you call into the office, they're going to tell you to go away. So all of this kind of stuff to say that we're really serious about it, and it doesn't matter what level you are in the organization, you have to do this. Here's the rules, here's the culture, we are going to set the example. And he really talked about how important that was for leadership to set the example from the top. Because you can't expect it to filter across the company, or you can't expect to write it down in a strategic plan and then just hope it'll happen. You have to model the behavior, you have to show it, and you have to have firm policies, procedures in place to make sure it actually happens. And so that's a good example because he's been a great mental health advocate. The other thing that I think is really interesting about his bank is that over the last 10, 15 years, looking at his finances, looking at the books of the bank, you wouldn't know there was a financial crash. It didn't happen at this bank. And I talked to him about that too, and he said, even 10, 15 years ago, before the financial crash, he was looking in the books, and he was saying, some people are making a lot of money in this place, or from this investment, or from this repackaged debt. Is it good? And he essentially said, I will not have crap on my books. I'm not going to have this stuff, even if we're going to make a bit of money in the short term. And he said, I don't care if we're selling it to the little ladies, or our investment arm of our company, I'm not going to have this crap on my books. And so when the crash happened, they flopped. And I think that's really tied in, like you can't quite separate those two because he's got that very kind of ethical, proactive approach to employee mental health, to making it a great place to work, to making it a sustainable company, and to making that success happen in all aspects of the business. And it's a very long-term strategic approach to employee health, engagement, and well-being, instead of that kind of very short-term approach to getting something very good on the books that lasts good for a week or a month, but isn't sustainable in the long term. So I really like that example. I like it because sometimes there's negative examples in the banking sector, but I like to use the positive one. And I'll talk a bit about his profile too. But we just talked about that, and it's a long-term, ongoing process, building a culture, to making a difference, and to making sure that it's not a one-off intervention, it's something you're constantly looking at. So go back again and look at the health insurance costs and see if you've changed it. Is an intervention, is mental health training going to help that process? Are you changing the costs, or are more people accessing it, and is that a good thing? So it's kind of constant evaluation, constantly looking at the processes, trying new things, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, look at examples of good companies, and see what they're doing, and steal those if they're working, and hopefully improving that employee engagement. The other thing Lloyd talked about, CEO of this bank, was that one of the things he did site inspections, but not kind of formal inspections, but having chats. And all of the senior leadership would, once every week or two, would go to different sites, to branches, to different locations, and have informal chats with people, and say, what's going right, what's going wrong, what are we doing well, what don't you like? And he said you can do those in 2 ways. Some people do inspections where you line people up and make sure the floors are scrubbed. That's not the best way to do it because people aren't presenting you the reality of where it is on the ground. The other alternative is you can just come in and have chats with people, and that works. And you have to be honest, you have to be willing to take the feedback, you have to listen to people, and if people do tell you about problems, you have to fix them. Because if you listen to people with the problems that you can't fix and ignore them, then people aren't going to tell you about them. What's the point? Right? So it can be challenging to do, even in a leadership position, to hear stuff that is negative or to hear stuff that's critical. But you have to be able to do it, and if you want to fix anything, you have to listen to it. Because often there's a big distance between a senior leader or a CEO and a bank clerk or someone in a branch. But they know what's going on. They know what the problems are. They know what the customers are loving or pissed off about. So it's really good to listen to them and get all of that information. So again, deciding to change the culture, it's really important that it comes from the top down. There can be grassroots initiatives, there can be people doing stuff from across the organization, but without leadership buy-in, it won't happen. And focus on ensuring leadership participation. So I'm just going to check the time because I don't want to go over time too much. And reducing presenteeism was focused on this too. So that was a really important part of trying to reduce burnout, is having people in the office when they're being productive, when they're being effective, but not making it a competition to see who's doing the most hours. Because that's really counterproductive, especially when people are exhausted. If people are exhausted the entire day, not being most effective, it's not as good as having someone work effectively for 8 hours. Or sometimes not as good as having a flexible work schedule if someone's, as a kid they're worried about, wants to go home early. There's no point in having someone in the office who is stressed, burnt out, worried, when there's accommodations that can be made to have people work when they're most effective and when they're most productive. It's important to talk about that too in the context of that kind of workplace flexibility, because there's a lot of new opportunities for people to work remotely, to work from home, to telecommute, all of this stuff. The technology's there, but it still has to be managed properly. So when you're looking at flexible working arrangements, you need to make sure there's still a process in place. People still have the same support, because sometimes what happens when people remotely is that they don't get those supports, so they're off on their own or left, or they don't have the same type of performance management framework, the same type of structure, or the same development training opportunities that you might get while you're in the company. So again, all of this stuff needs to have a formal structure, a process, and a really strong buy-in from leadership. Upside down now. The other thing, so looking at employee engagement, measuring engagement is really good too if you're looking at those engagement surveys. You want some sort of metric. You want to be able to test it, especially if you're doing initiatives or interventions. You need to have a measure to see if things are improving, if things are changing, and to get a good insight into that. So I'm going to go to the traits of high potential leaders now. This is the HPTI. This is now in about the 8th year of development, and I've got a profile of Lloyd's leadership leader. But this was developed specifically to improve upon current measures of personality at work. So we especially wanted to look at the traits of leadership, and we wanted to make sure it was really outcome focused. So at this point, we've tested tens of thousands of people all working all around the world. We've validated mostly in the UK, Europe, North America, but we do have more international data as well. The other thing we've done is we've done research with senior leaders. So we have longitudinal data with VP, CEO level multinational strategic leaders. So that's really important for this to verify and to validate it, because if we're saying we're predicting leadership potential, we need a huge amount of data from leaders to say that these are effective senior leaders. The other thing, because we've got longitudinal long-term data, is we know that they're effective. So you need to make sure when you're testing leaders too that they don't just happen to be the CEO, they're effective, productive, good CEOs. So we know we're measuring kind of senior strategic effective leadership. And we've developed, this tool is about twice as predictive as some of the best other measures of personality. So has anyone heard of the Big Five measure personality? That's the kind of standard academic one that's really good. But we did a whole bunch of research with the Norwegian Armed Forces a while ago, and we found that the HPTI was more than twice as predictive of assessing leadership potential and actually leadership success. So they do a long process of, they use Big Five, they use intelligence, that are just great for getting lots of data. And so we found that it was really effective, twice as effective as other measures of personality for predicting leadership potential. So that was in a middle level. We've also done kind of multinational corporate studies with very senior level leadership. And so these are 6 traits. If you're familiar with the Big Five, you might notice that there's some overlap with the Big Five. We revised it so it's all focused on a workplace-based context. They're all questions about work, about colleagues, Some of the components of the big five are areas that they work related specifically to work performance and leadership. So I'll go through these in more detail. And these are ranked essentially in order of importance. So the top one is the best measure to predict leadership potential, other than intelligence. But personality-wise, conscientiousness is the best. Adjustment, which is the second, which is the opposite of big five neuroticism. And they're all important, some important in different contexts. So I'm just going to go through them and talk about what they are. So conscientiousness is a focus on long-term goals, being disciplined, being self-motivated. This is the one that's on pretty much every CV or every job application form. They want self-starters, they want self-motivated. That's usually conscientiousness. So people with higher conscientiousness tend to perform more effectively in leadership roles because not only do you need to manage yourself, your own schedule, your own planning, you need to manage other people as well. Whereas there are kind of positives and negatives to being on either side of the spectrum. So people with lower conscientiousness tend to report being more adaptable, spontaneous, flexible, easygoing. We tend to see these people more successful in marketing, communications, artistic type roles that are more kind of spur of the moment, less about long-term planning. The next one is adjustment. So adjustment is essentially resilient to stress. So everyone has kind of a different threshold, a different level of stress that they can deal with. People with higher adjustment tend to get stressed out a lot less often. They worry less, they're less anxious, and that's kind of it's a biochemical mechanism. It is rooted in neurochemistry, and everyone has a different level of kind of stress that they can deal with. So some people with really high adjustment are resilient to most types of stressors. People with lower adjustment tend to be a bit more vulnerable to stress, feel it more keenly. The advantages of that is sometimes if you're kind of more aware of your own stress or other people, you're more attuned to what kind of other people's emotions are, what's going on around you. Sometimes people with higher adjustment seem a bit more cool and aloof because they're not showing that emotion or stress as much as other people. And it's interesting because conscientiousness and adjustment are both really closely related to work engagement. So we find higher adjustment, people tend to be more engaged. People with lower adjustment tend to get more stressed, are more prone to burnout. So that's not necessarily saying you shouldn't hire people who have low adjustment or low conscientiousness. It's just knowing the different levels of personality traits that are going to be risk factors. Right? So if you know someone who does a really good job, they're a good performer, but they're anxious all the time, then you might need to look at having different types of supports or feedback or kind of relationships with managers for people who are more likely to get burned out. And know that if there's a difficult time or a difficult thing with a client or the financial situations are difficult or if there's layoffs, certain people are going to be more stressed about that. It doesn't mean they can't perform well, but it does mean there's different supports and to be aware of that. So it can be really useful to do these kind of tests to know what people can react to, what people might be triggered or worried by, and how do you support them. The next one, curiosity. So that's about approach to new information. So people with high curiosity, HPTI curiosity, are interested in new approaches, learning new things, new information, specifically related to work. So again, this is an important one for leadership because if you're leading a team or leading a company, you need to be asking good questions, considering all the possibilities, getting information, and using the best approaches. So people with lower curiosity tend to be more dependable, focused, consistent. And ambiguity is a bit different from curiosity. Ambiguity is about complexity. And there's a huge amount of research about ambiguity in leadership that started in about the 40s and 50s that found people with very low ambiguity tolerance, ambiguity approach tended to have a very dictatorial approach. So that's the kind of getting rid of ambiguity, getting rid of complexity. Here's a quick, easy, simple, and appealing message. And the research from that tends to be that doesn't tend to be an effective method of leadership. So when we're looking at effective leadership, we're looking at higher ambiguity approach or acceptance. So that's being able to take lots of different information, lots of different opinions, lots of stuff from lots of different experts, and using that information to be most effective, instead of kind of reducing things to oversimplified, sometimes appealing messages. I'm not going to use any examples from politics because I get in trouble for that, so you can use your imagination. The next one is risk approach. So this one's really important too, especially for leadership, because this comes from the positive psychology research. So again, this is really related to how people end up with burnout or work engagement. And this is either a kind of reactive or a proactive approach to difficulties and challenge at work. Again, very important for leadership. So people with the higher risk approach tend to take a more thoughtful, considered approach. People in a positive mental state tend to consider more potential options for how to resolve problems. On the other side, people are kind of lower risk approach, people who are really stressed, tend to lash out or react automatically to stress. So that can either be the fight or flight approach. You either confront it or you run away. Instead of usually there's a better option in the middle for a way to solve the problem, address the challenge. So again, this is really interesting to know when situations are stressful or in difficult projects at work, because people at different ends of the spectrum might react differently to it. So again, are going to need different support. So if someone has really low risk approach, you probably don't want to take a confrontational, aggressive approach to them because they'll react instantly. The final one is competitiveness. This is an interesting one too because for all of these traits, we've got different optimal levels. So we're not necessarily saying higher is better. We've got a certain range that is most effective for leadership. And if you have a sales profile, you've got a different level that might be most effective for that. Generally, we're looking at the moderately higher. This one, for competitiveness in leadership, we find the most effective leaders are right in the middle. They're almost average in that sense. So really high competitiveness tends to be really good in things like individual sports, when people are fighting for their lives and their career and what they want to do. It tends not to be great in team sports. So people who are trying to get the most attention, the most credit, the most recognition, and seem like the best are not the best leaders, especially if they're taking away the credit from people who are in their team. So it's good for leaders to have moderate competitiveness and to be able to kind of sublimate that competitiveness towards the performance of the team, the performance of the company, but not necessarily being the kind of only figurehead. So those are those traits, and so it's really good to look at the personality combinations of the traits too, so they don't exist in isolation. So when you're looking at things like someone with really high conscientiousness and really high adjustment, they tend to be more adaptive, less likely to have burnout. So it's just good to know about. This is now the profile of Lloyd Craig, who's the leader I was talking about earlier. I published this before, so he doesn't mind me sharing it. So that's an interesting one. Conscientiousness, you almost never see it that high. It's about 4 standard deviations above the normal. So that's about 1 in 10,000 people. I've done 100 on conscientiousness. Most people are in the kind of 40 to 60 range. So that is a very strategic, very long-term focus, very motivated kind of person. Adjustment, again, very high level of adjustment. I mean, if you're the CEO of a bank, you're going to have stresses. You need a moderate level of adjustment to be able to deal with stress. Curiosity, interesting, we got in the optimal range. So moderately high, but a good amount of asking questions. That's that kind of stuff to say, let's look at the insurance reports, let's look at the books and say where we're making the money from, where the costs are, what the problems are. Let's ask the questions and then find out the results. Risk approach, again, is that kind of constructive approach to risk. So this is a guy, he's very assertive, let's say, and has a very assertive, but very proactive, very productive approach to risk. But he's not someone who's going to let problems kind of go on, unresolved or leave things. If there's problems, if there's conflict, that's going to be sorted out right away. But again, this is a kind of productive, proactive approach to the risk. It's not a kind of aggressive one, like shut it down and punch it. Interestingly, the ambiguity acceptance is still in the moderate range. So this is kind of moderate approach to complexity. Let's get some of the information, but we need to make a decision. Sometimes at the really high levels of ambiguity and curiosity, you see people who spend more time looking for things and trying new things and getting things done. So that's where the balance can be healthy. And again, competitiveness is quite high. In this sense, higher than we would always see for optimal, but we tend to see in finance, competitiveness is just generally higher. I mean, if you look at the insurance brokers and stuff, they're always off the chart for competitiveness. So he's probably average or low for his organization, but not necessarily for the overall population. And here's another, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. So when you're looking at individual well-being, you want to really look at the traits that fit the person's work. So if it's a job like leadership that requires managing a lot of stress, it's really important to have people who can manage the level of stress. And when you're looking at kind of development, training, succession planning, look at what people want to do and the amount of stress they want to have in their work. Because what often happens all the time is you have, say, a really high-performing salesperson, who's great at their job, making lots of money, loves it, is really good at it, and then so you take them and make them the sales manager, right? This happens in everything from nurses to nurse managers, and then they go from being the best salesperson to the worst manager. Because they don't like it, they don't want to do it, it's an absolutely different skill set, and they're watching everyone else do something they used to love doing. So it's really good to know which traits fit the person and the type of work. And when you're looking at these technical roles or sales roles, they're a very, very different profile than managerial roles. And that's often a path to burnout, is when you promote someone into a role they don't actually want. So it's good to have those conversations about what are your traits, what fits, what skills do you need, what are the skills gaps, and do you really want to do this? So there's all sorts of things you can do to kind of make that process easier. So you can do like job sharing or stretch assignments where people try out the role, have a few days in it, do a few days a week of it, see if they like it, see how they fit in it, if they're good or not, if they like it, instead of just kind of dumping someone in a role that they might not like. Because that's going to be not great for their mental health and not great for the people around them if they don't want to be doing that job. Time for, I think, one more case study. I don't want to steal your time. This is a good example that I like too, because this is a case study. It was a woman who was on a board that I worked on a while ago. And it was, we were having a bit of conflict. And one of the problems was that we hadn't done the personality traits, we hadn't looked at that yet or anything. But there were a few people on the board who weren't doing their job. They weren't getting the stuff done that they needed to do. That always happens. Any group, any team, anywhere, there's always a few people who we have trouble with. Interestingly, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and we used the HPTI, and we used this, and we found something very unsurprising, which she had very high conscientiousness and very low ambiguity acceptance. So that's a profile which, if you realize it, it's great to work for. So that's the kind of person who says, I'll work hard, I'll get all this stuff done, I'll work whatever hours, but I need really specific instructions and guidelines. And that's the thing that wasn't working out, is we were very strategic as a board. We had lots of ideas, people would go off and do all their own stuff, but there wasn't always enough clarity. And some of the people on the board worked great like that. They would go off, take it fun with it, fine. But for her, she needed those specific instructions, guidelines. She was like, I want to know the process, I want to know the criteria, I want to know what success looks like, and I want that process. And then once she had that, she worked harder than any of us. Which was good because it was interesting to see that that conflict wasn't from an actual performance issue. It was from misunderstanding kind of her traits, how she worked, how we could all work best in the organization. So it's funny because if you have those miscommunications and don't understand it about people, you can kind of fight a bit about it instead of realizing how people can perform the best. So that makes a big difference, and that's why it's good to test these traits, to look at them, to talk about them. Sometimes having just this common framework to talk about personality, styles, motivation, all that stuff, is really useful because you can do it in a more threatening, or less threatening way. So you're all kind of on the same page. And you can say, these are my personality traits, they're consistent, they don't change much over your life, this is kind of how I am. And then you can kind of talk about strengths and weaknesses and how to work with each other on that. So for individual well-being, again, you're looking at those personal and organizational supports. So in the previous example, that can be something as easy as saying, okay, here's the specific guidelines for your work, or here's the flexibility you need to do it. Often it's coaching, mentoring. It's always good to have someone to talk to at work, whether it's your boss, whether it's a coach, someone you can bring issues to confidentially or discuss problems with, or look for solutions and stuff. And sometimes you may want to bring it to a manager, and sometimes you may just want to talk to someone about it. So it's good to have those people. Sometimes it's just a colleague. But the other main factor in burnout, let's skip ahead to this, you've probably seen this before, so job demands versus job resources. And you'll often see people in very difficult, very kind of high-performing jobs who are very highly engaged. I've done a whole bunch of work in hospitals, looking at kind of organizational well-being, networks, communication networks, and physicians and nurses are some of the most highly engaged people in the hospital studies I've done, because it's really, really tough work, but they're really engaged doing it. And they get a lot of personal meaning from it. They say they are energized by it. Some of them are burnt out and exhausted, but are also really love the work they're doing and what they get from it. And that's because in the kind of best circumstances, they have the right resources for the jobs. Hopefully they have access to the other specialists, they've got access to nursing staff, they've got all of the resources, the technology they need. I mean, there's often problems with funding and resources and stuff in hospitals, but if they have the right level of resources to meet those demands, then it helps. So if you've got everything you need to do your job really well, then you're more likely to be engaged in it. Whereas if you're given a task that, let's say you have to do telemarketing, you're not going to give it a phone. Right? Like that's going to stress you out because you don't have the resources you need to do the job. And the same, perfect. And so the same can be true of support with colleagues, access to professionals, access to other people in the organization. you need to talk to get your job done. And again, this model is really important too when you're looking at stress and flow and well-being, because not necessarily all stress is bad. Stress is generally kind of a normal, natural, evolutionary response to threat. But there's a big difference between kind of unmanageable stress, unreasonable stress, constant stress, and a little bit of stress. So stress essentially activates your body and your mind, right? So it's making you focus on something. We often find entrepreneurs have really low levels of adjustment. Often successful entrepreneurs have low adjustment levels, and they're stressing about everything, which if they have low adjustment and high conscientiousness, and they're worrying about all the different parts of their business, and then using that worry to address the problems, they do really well. And we find, especially in early levels of entrepreneurship, when you are your own marketing department, your own finance department, your own communications department, you have to do your own taxes, being stressed about all of that stuff can be useful if you are capable of dealing with that stress. If you can get it all done, if you can use that attention and stress to focus on the problems, then that can be really useful, really effective, and productive. The problem is if you don't have enough time, or you don't have the resources, or you don't have the capability to do it, that's when burnout happens. So again, when you're looking at arousal, stress, kind of moderate levels of stress are great for bringing your attention to things, focusing on things, and thinking about them. And individual well-being is often more straightforward to measure. Sometimes the conversations about organizational culture can be a bit fuzzy, a bit not less specific. So often measuring individual well-being, looking at engagement surveys, individual levels of health, of turnover, sick days, absences, is a useful way of gauging corporate culture and gauging it over the long term, so you can see changes year to year. Organizational culture is harder to quantify. You can describe it, but it's sometimes hard to measure. So going back to the beginning, I think I've got 4 main messages. The first one is there's significant room for improvement. I mean, you guys are all here because you know this is an issue, right? You know there's an issue with burnout and mental health, and looking at it in the workplace. And we've got a long way to go, which in a way is a good thing, because there's a huge amount of room for improvement on it. There's a huge amount we can do. Some of the stuff like testing personality, having good assessments, having good measures of kind of assessing people, having development processes, retention is really good. Improving well-being at work is a leadership imperative. So it's almost impossible to do without leadership buy-in. You can try it, it might work to a certain level, but you need to have that senior leadership buy-in to it. And needs to be reinforced by leadership performance metrics too. This is really important because you need to make sure, if you're really serious about it, that your leadership is evaluated on employee engagement. So you can evaluate leaders based on profit, based on turnover, all of these things, but put some engagement metrics in the leadership performance. Make their bonus count on improving these metrics. It'll make a big difference. Effective leaders have specific personality traits. So we've got a lot on the HPTI. If you read the high potential book, there's chapters and chapters in this about what the HPTI is related to specific leadership potential and outcomes. But there is a really clear profile of successful, effective senior strategic leaders, and we can measure that. So those traits really predict individual performance and how to shape company culture. And finally, individual well-being is linked to personality traits. In 2 ways, really. So we know certain personality traits people tend to get less burnout. High conscientiousness, high adjustment, people tend to be more engaged. But looking at the individual variation, the different levels, is really how you can look at giving different supports to workers. Do people need, that clarity to do a job in a specific way, or do they want the flexibility to do it in their own way? What are the supports? How can you help people to do that? And I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. And I took books, so thank you for coming today.